All right, so let's go back just a little bit. Okay, closely related to what I've been talking about is another classical idea, and you can find this in ancient thought. You can also find it in various forms in the Middle Ages, and you certainly can find it in the period that we are now studying. This is called by a modern scholar named Lovejoy, by the way, The Great Chain of Being. And that's the title of his book, in which he discusses this at length. The Great Chain of Being. So the notion was that there is a hierarchy or chain extending from God down to chaos. God is perfect. That's what God is, the definition, as it were, of God. And then the angels, as spiritual beings, are very close to God, but they're not gods. And then we have humans who are somewhat like the angels, and therefore somewhat like God, but they're not angels. We human beings are not angelic, okay? And notice that we come in the middle of this hierarchy because we are more or less equally balanced between our spiritual nature and our physical nature. The angels are more spiritual and much less physical. And then God is pure spirit. God is pure spirit. But then below humans, notice, there are animals. Now, according to the ancient philosophers, according to Aristotle, for example, animals have souls. And you all know that animals have personalities. I mean, if you've been around animals, you may have cats or dogs or horses or something like that, or have been around them. And you know that animals have personalities, don't they? In a certain sense. Well, it was thought by ancient philosophers like Aristotle that animals have souls. They just don't have souls that are as highly developed as ours. They don't have the capacity of reason. But they do have other kinds of capabilities, memory, will, and so forth, that we also have. And then you get down to plants. Aristotle said that plants had souls too, but of a lower order than the souls, as it were, of animals. And then we get down to what the ancients regarded as inorganic matter. And finally, chaos. Now, chaos was thought by the ancients to be pure, unformed matter. Pure, unformed matter. That the act of creation, even in the Bible, I'm not talking about just Aristotle and Plato and so forth, is what? It is creation by God picking up loose dirt and apparently spitting into it and then shaping it into the form of a man, right? In other words, this is unformed matter, or chaos, what the ancients called chaos, which then is formed into whatever it becomes. A human being, a horse, a tree, whatever that is. Okay? So we have then a great chain of being, and if we can go back to the screen just for a moment, please. Notice that humans should try to behave as much as they can according to the principle of those above them. In other words, the more that we could cultivate our spiritual selves, the more we would become like angels, and at least to some extent, we could even aspire to become something like God. I mean, we can't be God, but we could be God-like in certain respects, and certainly angel-like. But look at it if we go in the opposite direction. What if we descend below ourselves and we become like animals? Notice we still use those metaphors, don't we? So-and-so behaved like an animal. So-and-so is a beast, right? Or maybe even specifying particular animals. He's a pig, she's a dog, you know, so-and-so is a, I don't know what all, you know, a snake or something like that. That when we liken somebody to an animal, what we're really doing is we're invoking, without perhaps even realizing it, something like this great chain of being idea. Okay? Or if we say he or she is an angel, we also are. We also are invoking, whether we realize it or not, something like this great chain of being. Now we're going to find that all over the place in this literature. Now, remember again that that kind of great hierarchy also leads to a moral hierarchy in which reason is seen not simply as an intellectual faculty for knowing, not simply as a faculty for knowing, such as I use my reason to study mathematics or languages or study for an examination. But reason also is regarded by the ancients as a moral faculty, a moral faculty. Reason, as the poet John Donne, in a poem we're going to read a little bit later on in the course, as the poet John Donne says, is God's viceroy in me. What's a viceroy? A viceroy is a vice king. It's a vice king. The king can't be everywhere, and so in many ancient monarchical systems, what they would do is the king would appoint somebody to be a viceroy to act on behalf of the king in a particular location. Well, according to this view, that's what God has done. God has implanted in us reason to be his viceroy in us as a moral guide in our personality. Passion, which is not bad in and of itself, but passion, if uncontrolled by reason, subverts God's natural moral order or God's natural law, as it was called. Okay? So the role of reason, what the ancients called right reason, what the Roman philosophers called recta ratio, or right reason. The role of right reason is to make moral decisions about how we will behave and to what extent we will exercise our passions. Okay? But our passion should always be under control of reason. And if the passions overturn the rule of reason in our personality, then everything has gotten topsy-turvy in a moral sense. Now notice that that's going to be changed in the material of the next course beyond this one. The course beyond this one, that begins at the end of the 18th century and then goes into the early 19th century and so forth, up to more or less the present time. At the beginning of that course, we study Romanticism. Romanticism deliberately undercuts the kind of thinking that I'm talking about right now. Because the Romantics will again and again and again and again, in all sorts of ways, or at least some of the Romantics, will say, reason be damned, there is, you know, there's something more fundamental than that. And in fact, that reason can sometimes lead us astray so that we don't fulfill our personalities and our beings and all of our promise. Well, That's way, way, way in the future. And I realize that what I've just said is itself a gross simplification. But for the moment, the kind of moral hierarchy that I'm talking about prevails, at least as a prevailing cultural ideology. Okay. And so now I want to begin to talk about poetry, especially the sonnet sequence. And we're going to look at two sonnet sequences here, Sidney's Astrophel and Stella and Spenser's Amoretti. The sonnet is a 14-line poem, and it can take different forms, as we shall see. Let's talk a little bit about the content of the sonnet and the influence of the Italian poet Petrarch on the content of the Elizabethan sonnets and sonnet sequences. Petrarch, as you may know, was a very famous Italian poet. Okay, so in England, the sonnets preserved many of the conventions, for example, of the treatment of love, derived from medieval courtly love and such Roman poetry as that of Ovid. So you constantly have the conventions of the lady, and the lady on the pedestal, and the lady to whom the man must pay court, and so on and so on. And we'll look at some very specific instances of this in just a moment. And these conventions were usually presented in what were called conceits. 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 And what that means is what I've written there, or what Johnson called discordia concours. What that means is that there would be images brought together, in which there typically would be a kind of tension between the images. A kind of tension between the images. Okay? And then let's talk about the form of the sonnet. Slow me down if you want me to slow down a little bit. Okay? Everybody following? Okay, and Petrarch and his poetry promoted a shift toward the reemergence of Neoplatonism, at least in the poetry of the time. How far did that go? You know, into science and so forth? Well, that's another question. But certainly in the poetry, you find this all over the place. Okay, so here's the influence of Petrarch on form. We have the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet form. And those terms are synonymous, by the way. Sometimes it's called the Petrarchan sonnet, sometimes it's called the Italian sonnet. 14-line poem divided into an octave and a sestet. Octave means 8 lines, and sestet means 6 lines. And there are all kinds of variations, and I've just given an illustration. Those letters, by the way, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and so forth, are used to designate the rhymes at the ends of lines. The rhymes at the ends of lines. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a moment. And of course, there are numerous variations of this pattern. Let me see what I've got on this next one here. So here's the influence of Petrarch on the form of the sonnet. And by the way, sonnets are everywhere. Sonnets are everywhere. People are writing sonnets all over the place. Yes? Go back for a second. Okay. Sonnets are everywhere. And poets generally are expected to establish themselves by proving their mastery of the sonnet. And the sonnet is a very demanding form. In fact, in classes sometimes, I have actually required people to write a sonnet. Doesn't have to be a good sonnet. Maybe a terrible sonnet. And you may think, oh my God, I'm not a poet, I can't do that. It's okay. I ask people to do it so that they would understand how the sonnet form works, even if they didn't write a particularly successful sonnet. Okay, ready to move along? In the structure of the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, typically, the octave, the first 8 lines, will present a problem or theme. And then that problem or theme will be resolved, or at least reflected upon, in the sestet, the 6 lines that follow. Okay? So you've got 2 parts of the Italian sonnet. The octave, the first 8 lines presenting the problem, or the question, or the theme, and then the last 6 lines that is attempt to answer the question, resolve the problem, or expand on the theme. The sonnet sequence is a narrative where you can put together one sonnet after another sonnet, after another sonnet, after another sonnet. And typically, these involve the narratives of a love affair. Narratives of a love affair. From the beginnings of the love affair, from the sonneteer's point of view, who's usually male, talking about, you know, when he first sees the lady and he's stunned by her beauty and falls in love with her and then attempts to approach her and so on and so on and so on, until you finally have the fulfillment of their love relationship. But there are lots of ups and downs along the way in the narrative of the sonnet sequence. Now, in the English or Shakespearean sonnet, it's called Shakespearean only because Shakespeare is its greatest practitioner, but there were lots of other English poets who used this sonnet form. You have 3 quatrains. A quatrain is 4 lines. A quatrain is 4 lines. So again, it's a 14-line poem, right? So if you had 3 groupings of 4, 3 quatrains, that adds up to 12, and then you have a concluding couplet. A concluding couplet. So that the structure of the sonnet is different from the Italian form. I give you an example. Though there are lots of different rhyme schemes possible. We're going to go through some of these in a moment. I'll show you some of the poems. Generally, each quatrain in the English sonnet presents an aspect of a problem or theme, and then the couplet provides a conclusion or final comment, which is often witty. In Shakespeare, Shakespeare is a very witty guy, as you know, and in Shakespeare they're often very funny, sometimes satirical. Okay, so you have a different pattern or a different structure to the form in the English sonnet than in the Italian sonnet. Okay. And then another thing we're going to be considering as we look at these poems, which are all about love, or they're usually about love, let me put it that way. It's possible to write sonnets that are not about love, but that's the commonest theme for the sonnets that we're going to be looking at. So what are some of the cultural assumptions about gender? What are some of the spoken assumptions about femininity, masculinity, and sexuality? I mean, if we're talking about male-female relations, you know, what are the assumptions about what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine, or about sexuality in a more general sense? So that we can look at some of the spoken assumptions and also some of the unspoken assumptions about these things. Okay? All right. So let's now go to Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. I've given you a whole bunch of stuff to think about, but let's actually get down to looking at the poems themselves. Astrophil and Stella. Sir Philip Sidney. Okay, everybody catching up here? Okay, sonnet number 1. Sonnet number 1. Under Astrophil and Stella. What does the title mean? Anybody know? What does the title mean?
Stella refers to a star.
Stella is the Latin word for a star.
And Astrophil is a play on his name.
It's a play on whose name? Oh, that's interesting. On Sir Philip Sidney's name?
Astro is
Oh,
a lover of the star.
Right. The Greek word philia means love, and astro, you know, is star, right? So this is star, lover, and star, literally. But of course, he's put this in classical form, hasn't he? You know, playing on both Greek and Latin. Again, classical humanism, right? Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that the dear she might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled stepdame study's blows, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus great with child to speak and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Well, look at what this poem is about. It's about this guy who wants to approach the lady, to whom he's very much attracted, obviously, and he is trying to figure out how to write a poem for her. And that'll get her attention, surely, in which he expresses his feelings for her. And so he's reading the poems by other people to try to get some inspiration, to try to get some ideas. But he finally realizes that that's not going to help him at all. That the only way he can really create the kind of poem that will express his true feeling is to look into his own heart and write. So, notice how it's divided into quatrains. And then look at the rhyme scheme here. Show, pain, know, obtain. So that's A, B, A, B. You see how I got that scheme? The A, B, A, B. And then we move again. Woe, entertain, flow, brain. Okay? A, B, A, B again. And then we have stay, blows, way, throws. Okay? So stay, blows, way, throws would be C, D, C, D. And then spite and right would be E, E, the concluding couplet. Okay? It's just as simple as that. It's not very difficult. And once you come to be able to recognize those kinds of patterns, you don't have to memorize them all, but just to recognize that there are those kinds of patterns, you will begin to see how different poets are playing with the possibilities of the sonnet form. Okay. Loving in truth and fain in verse, my love to show. I wanted to show her in verse, my love. That the dear she, the dear loved one, might take some pleasure of my pain. See, this is a common, what we call oxymoron in poetry. This has been taken over by other people who now talk about oxymorons here and there and so forth, like television journalists. But the term actually comes out of poetry. And an oxymoron is O, X, Y, oxymoron. Okay, oxymoron. I don't know what that's doing there, but anyway. Oxymoron. Okay? And an oxymoron is a poetic figure in which you have two things that seem to be contradictory being presented at the same time. Like the lover may say, I burn and freeze. You see, I am in fire and in ice. You know, over my lady. A way of trying to express the extreme conflict of his feelings. Okay. That she might take some pleasure of my pain. I am in pain because I love the lady, whom I can't have, by the way. And I hope that at least through writing a poem to her, that she will get some pleasure of the pain that I feel now. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. And the older meaning of the word pity didn't mean exactly what we mean. It was something like our word empathy, to have feeling, fellow feeling for another person. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. My blackest face of woe. You see, I am in pain because I'm in love with this woman who is not returning the love to me. Studying inventions fine. Studying poets and poems and their inventions. Her wits to entertain. Oft turning others' leaves, the leaves of books, by other poets, to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting, that is to say, without, true invention. Because invention, which is the child of nature, springs from nature, flees away from study if all I'm trying to do is read books and study on how to write a love poem, rather than simply to express my feelings in my love poem, then obviously I'm on the wrong track. And others' feet in the sense of poetic feet. You know, we can divide up a line into what are called metrical feet. You see, thus great with child to speak and helpless in my throes. Those are iambic metrical feet. We don't have to get into those technicalities, but that's what he's talking about here. Seem but strangers in my way, thus great with child to speak, pregnant, as it were. And helpless in my throes, I can't give birth to this poem. Biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite, fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. My muse? My muse? What are muses? What's the muse? Anybody heard that expression before? Yeah, go ahead.
They're classical spirits that give inspiration?
Yes, that's true. That give inspiration, and there are various muses, one of which is the muse of poetry. And this was what was thought, or at least what was conceived in poetical fashion, to be the source of inspiration. Who knows where inspiration comes from? Haven't you had some great idea sometime? You know, where does that come from? Where does that come from? Well, the mythological way of explaining this for the ancient Greeks was, it's the muse who has inspired me. Well, okay, so let's see how our poet fares. Let's look over at sonnet number 10. We're going to see a lot of playing with words here. Reason. He's addressing reason. Reason, in faith thou art well served, that still wouldst brabbling be with sense and love in me. I rather wish thee climb the Muses' hill, or reach the fruit of nature's choicest tree, or seek heaven's course, or heaven's inside to see. Why shouldest thou toil our thorny soil to till? Leave sense and those which sense's objects be. Deal thou with powers of thoughts. Leave love to will. But thou wouldst needs fight, both with love and sense, with sword of wit, giving wounds of dispraise, till downright blows did foil thy cunning fence. For soon as they strake thee with Stella's rays, reason thou kneeledest and offeredest straight to prove, by reason good, good reason her to love. And notice what he's doing is he's talking about the different functions of reason, but then finally, of course, as we get to the end of the sonnet, he is simply struck by the rays of his Stella. And remember that he's playing with the fact that her name means star. And stars put out light rays. Well, okay, let's look at another one of these. 41. Having this day my horse, my hand, my lance, guided so well that I obtained the prize, presumably either on the battlefield or in some sporting combat, like jousting. Both by the judgment of the English eyes and of some sent from that sweet enemy, France. It's interesting, the sweet enemy, France. The English and the French have always had this kind of ambivalent attitude towards one another. Horsemen, my skill in horsemanship advance. Townsfolks, my strength. A daintier judge applies his praise to slight, which from good use doth rise. Some lucky wits impute it but to chance. Others, because of both sides I do take, my blood from them, who did excel in this, think nature me a man of arms did make. How far they shoot awry, the true cause is, Stella looked on, and from her heavenly face sent forth the beams which made so fair my race. In other words, people are trying to, they're not only praising me for my abilities on the field, but they're trying to figure out, how could he be so good at this? Little do they know. It's all because Stella was watching me, and that's what inspired me to greatness. Well, okay. Well, let's look at one more of these by Sidney. Number 81. O kiss, which dost those ruddy gems impart. The ruddy gems, presumably ruddy is an older word for red or reddish. Like somebody has a ruddy complexion, means that the person has a reddish complexion. And presumably what he's talking about here are what? Lips. Yeah, lips, exactly. Or gems or fruits of newfound paradise, breathing all bliss and sweetening to the heart, teaching dumb lips a nobler exercise. O kiss which souls, even souls together, ties by links of love, and only nature's art, how fain would I paint thee to all men's eyes, or of thy gifts at least shade out some part. But she forbids. With blushing words, she says she builds her fame on higher seated praise. Praise about the higher seat of her spirit, let's say. But my heart burns, I cannot silent be. Then, since dear life you fain would have me peace, and I, mad with delight, want wit to cease, stop you my mouth with still kissing me. Well, okay, a witty little poem. You know, she doesn't want him to be talking, about her kissing him. And so he says, okay, well, in that case, you can stop my mouth by kissing me more. Well. Okay, so let's go over to Spenser and look at some poems in his Amoretti. Amoretti are little loves or little love poems in Italian. And here we have, in his Sonnet 37, a very good example of the Petrarchan conceits in a sonnet. Petrarchan conceits in a sonnet. And I'll be explaining what I mean by that phrase as we go along. Okay, Spenser's Amoretti, Sonnet 37. Okay? People with me now? Okay. What guile is this? that those her golden tresses she doth attire under a net of gold. See, what she's done is she has golden hair, blonde hair. We're talking about Northern Europeans here, by the way. And so it would be not uncommon, not that everybody's blonde, but it wouldn't be uncommon to find a woman who would have golden hair. And she has a hairnet on her hair, okay? But the hairnet itself is going to be a kind of decoration because it's going to be bejeweled. What guile is this, that those her golden tresses she doth attire under a net of gold, and with sly skill so cunningly them dresses, that which is gold or hair may scarce be told. You see, her hair is so beautiful that it's impossible to tell the difference between the gold and her hair. Is it that men's frail eyes, which gaze too bold, she may entangle in that golden snare? You see, now the hairnet has become like a snare to catch men. And being caught may craftily enfold their weaker hearts, which are not well aware. Okay. Women in these sonnet sequences, by the way, are usually the stronger ones. And men have just the weaknesses that we all know all men have. So, take heed, therefore, mine eyes, how you do stare, henceforth too rashly on that guileful net, in which, if ever you entrapped are, out of her bands you by no means shall get. Fondness it were for any being free to covet fetters, though they golden be. And as the gloss in the margin points out, fond or fondness here used to mean, in Spencer's and Shakespeare's time, used to mean foolishness or even craziness. Okay, look at Sonnet 64. See, but you see the conceits? The central conceit here is the lady's gold hair being compared to the gold of her hairnet, and how her hair even outshines the beauty of the gold itself. Okay, that's the Petrarchan conceit. Sonnet 64. Coming to kiss her lips, such grace I found, meseemed I smelt a garden of sweet flowers, that dainty odors from them threw around for damsels fit to deck their lovers' bowers. Her lips did smell like unto gilly flowers, or carnations. Her ruddy cheeks like unto roses red. Her snowy brows like budded bellamores. Her lovely eyes like pinks but newly spread. See how she is likened in each case to some flower or other beautiful vegetation. Her goodly bosom like a strawberry bed, her neck like to a bunch of columbines, her breast like lilies ere their leaves be shed, her nipples like young blossomed jessamines. You may wonder about this. If you look at pictures of women at the time, they wore very low-cut dresses, by the way. Such fragrant flowers do give most odorous smell, but her sweet odor did them all excel. So here is this beautiful woman who even excels all of the beauties of nature. And by the way, what I was just talking about with women's dress at the time, that would apply to women of the court, women of upper classes, and so forth. Certainly not to the Puritans who were just beginning to get going. Okay, let's go over to Sonnet 79. Men call you fair, and you do credit it, for that yourself you daily such do see. You see, you are truly fair, and you know that. You can tell that by looking at the mirror. But the true fair, that is the gentle wit, wit is intelligence, by the way, and virtuous mind, that's true beauty, the virtuous mind, is much more appraised of me. For all the rest, however fair it be, shall turn to naught and lose that glorious hue. But only that is permanent and free from frail corruption that doth flesh and soul, that is true beauty, that doth argue you to be divine and born of heavenly seed, derived from that fair spirit from whom all true and perfect beauty did at first proceed. He only fair, and what he fair hath made, all other fair, like flowers, untimely fade. So see how that ties into the Neoplatonism I was talking about earlier on? You see, yes, she's very beautiful. And you look at her and you say, here is a beautiful woman. But that's not her greatest beauty. Her greatest beauty is her spiritual beauty, which ultimately comes from God and is a reflection of what God has planted as a spiritual force and therefore a spiritual beauty in her. And that's what shines forth in the beauty of her face, say. Okay? So, we are going to look at another example of this in the epithalamion, but we're running out of time today for doing that, so we'll just put that off until next time, when we're also going to be talking about Shakespeare's sonnets. But let me just close today's class with this one thought, that one of the things that people did, not only to establish themselves in court, but also often to establish themselves in their professions, was to write poetry. And this poetry was not usually for general publication in the way we publish books now, but often would be circulated only among relatively small groups. And then if really very, very successful, would eventually get published perhaps in chapbooks, little books, that the more general public might read. And so this was considered to be one of the accomplishments of a gentleman or of a lady. There were women who wrote sonnets and wrote other forms of poetry as well. Queen Elizabeth herself was a quite accomplished poet, scholar, and translator, by the way. So she was a model for her court. Okay.